Iron and mud, a world gone mad. The trenches stank. Acrid smoke from bursting shells mingled with the reek of sweat, mud, and something far worse, the stench of death. Rain hammered down, turning the churned earth into a sea of sucking mud. Barbed wire, twisted and torn, snaked across the landscape like the spines of slumbering dragons. This was 2024, but it felt like the abyss of history had swallowed us whole. World War III. We were fighting the Russians again. My name is Thomas. Just Thomas. No time for surnames in this godforsaken place. We were British soldiers dug in on the front line, a thin khaki line against the Russian tide. They called it the Iron Curtain in the old days. Now it was just iron and mud, soaked in blood. 15 days I spent in that hellhole. 15 days that felt like a lifetime. We were young, most of us barely old enough to shave. But war doesn't care about age. It chews you up and spits you out regardless. We were fighting for king and country, they told us, for freedom. But down here in the trenches, the only freedom we craved was the freedom from fear. The fear that clung to us like a second skin. 15 days, a lifetime in hell. The days blurred into one long nightmare. Sleep was a luxury we couldn't afford. The nights were worse. The darkness hid the enemy, but it also amplified every sound, every crackle of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth. Was it a rat or a Russian patrol creeping closer? The fear was a living thing, gnawing at our guts. Food was scarce. Hardtack biscuits, so hard they could break your teeth, and bullied beef that tasted like metal and despair. Water was even more precious. We drank from shell holes, praying we wouldn't get dysentery, but thirst was a powerful motivator, stronger even than fear. We were fighting alongside Americans, French, Germans, a whole alphabet soup of NATO troops. The enemy of my enemy was my friend, they said. But down here in the trenches, the only language we all spoke was the language of fear. The fear that united us, regardless of nationality, religion, or the color of our skin. We were all just cogs in the machine, fodder for the guns. The stench of fear and decay. I remember the rats, fat, fearless creatures feasting on the dead. They scurried through the trenches, their eyes glinting in the darkness. They were a plague, but we were too exhausted, too broken to even care. The trenches stank of death. The bodies of fallen comrades lay where they fell, too dangerous to retrieve under the constant enemy fire. The smell of rotting flesh permeated everything. It clung to our clothes, our skin, our hair. It was the smell of war. The smell we would carry with us long after the guns fell silent. I made friends in those trenches, lads I'd never met before, but who shared the same fears, the same hopes, the same dreams of going home. We watched each other's backs, shared our meager rations, and told stories to keep our spirits up. Stories of home, of loved ones, of a life that seemed a million miles away. Ghosts in the smoke, the enemy. We rarely saw the enemy. They were ghosts in the smoke, shadows in the night. But we heard them. Their voices, guttural and alien, carried on the wind. Their artillery rained down on us, turning our world into a landscape of craters and chaos. One day, during a lull in the fighting, I saw him. A Russian soldier, no older than me, standing on the edge of their trench. He was smoking a cigarette, his face a mask of exhaustion. For a moment, our eyes met. In that brief instant, we were not enemies, but two young men caught in a war we didn't understand. Then he was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the Russian soldier haunted me. Was he still alive? Did he have a family waiting for him back home? Was he as scared as I was? In the trenches, the enemy was faceless, nameless. But that day, I saw the human face of war, and it terrified me more than any artillery barrage. Brothers in arms, a glimmer of hope. The arrival of supplies was always a cause for celebration. Ammunition, food, water, and sometimes even letters from home. Those letters were precious, tangible links to the world we left behind. Reading them, we clung to the words, the memories, the hope they offered. One day, a new group of soldiers arrived, fresh-faced and eager. They were full of the naive enthusiasm of men who had yet to experience the true horrors of war. We watched them with a mixture of envy and pity. Envy for their innocence, pity for what they were about to endure. We tried to warn them, told them to keep their heads down, to never volunteer for anything, to cherish every moment above ground. But they wouldn't listen. They were full of fire, eager to prove themselves in battle. They hadn't yet learned that the only victory in this godforsaken place was survival. Hunger pangs and empty promises. Days turned into weeks, the rain never seemed to stop. Our uniforms were caked in mud, our boots rotted through. We were infested with lice, our bodies weary, our spirits broken. The promised offensive never came. We were stuck in this purgatory, waiting for Godot or death, whichever arrived first. Hunger gnawed at our bellies. The meager rations weren't enough. We scrounged for scraps, traded cigarettes for crusts of bread. Anything to take the edge off the constant gnawing hunger. We were slowly starving to death, and there was nothing we could do about it. The shelling intensified. Day and night, the enemy artillery pounded our positions. We huddled in our dugouts, praying the earth above would hold. Each explosion was a hammer blow, shaking us to our core. The world outside was a maelstrom of fire and steel, and we were trapped in the middle of it. Echoes of thunder. The barrage begins. One morning the earth shook with a deafening roar. It wasn't the familiar sound of artillery, but something far more ominous. The ground trembled and a shockwave ripped through the air, knocking us off our feet. We looked at each other, eyes wide with terror. This was it. This was the big one. The order came down the line, prepare to advance. A surge of adrenaline coursed through my veins, a potent cocktail of fear and excitement. This was what we had trained for, what we had dreaded. This was our moment of truth. We fixed bayonets, the steel cold and reassuring in our trembling hands. Our faces were grim, determined. We were about to enter the belly of the beast. Whether we emerged alive or not was in God's hands. A moment of truth charge into the unknown. We surged over the top of the trench, a wave of khaki and fury breaking against the storm. Machine guns chattered, spitting lead. Mortar shells rained down, exploding in showers of earth and shrapnel. Men screamed, fell, and were swallowed by the mud and the madness. Through the smoke and the chaos, I saw the enemy trenches. They were closer than I imagined. A tangled web of barbed wire and earth. We charged towards them. Our rifles spitting fire, our voices hoarse from shouting. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and blood. I don't remember much after that. It was a blur of noise and movement, of adrenaline and terror. I fired my rifle until it was empty, then fixed my bayonet and charged into the fray. It was kill or be killed. There was no other option. Sunrise over the trenches, a new dawn. When I regained consciousness, the sun was rising over the battlefield. The fighting had stopped. An eerie silence hung in the air, broken only by the moans of the wounded. I looked around, dazed and disoriented. Bodies lay scattered across the battlefield, friend and foe alike. The ground was littered with debris, the air thick with the stench of death. I had survived. I don't know how. Perhaps it was luck, perhaps divine intervention. Whatever the reason, I was alive. But the war had taken its toll. I had seen too much, experienced too much. The memories would haunt me forever. As I stumbled back towards our lines, I realized something had changed. The fear was gone. It had been replaced by something else. Emptiness. I was hollowed out, a shell of my former self. I had survived the trenches, but a part of me would forever remain buried in that God-forsaken place. The war was over for me, but the scars would remain forever.